Good afternoon. I'm Cornell Clayton. I'm the director of the Thomas S. Foley Institute at Washington State University. And on behalf of the Institute, I want to welcome you out to our continuing series on the 2020 election. Between now and Election Day on November 3rd, we will be bringing you the country's leading political experts talking about various aspects of the campaign and the election. These events are all free and they're open to the public. We live stream them to our YouTube station where you can see them live or at a later date. I want to thank the College of Arts and Sciences at Washington State University for supporting this series and supporting the Institute. And if you'd like more information about the series or any of our programs at the Institute, you should like us on Facebook, or you can go to our website at foley.wsu.edu. So today's event is going to focus on how we predict elections and the accuracy of polls and models. You know, something very strange is happening in this election. There's a slew of recent polls indicating Joe Biden is maintaining a commanding double-digit lead over Donald Trump. This morning, Nate Silver's 538 prediction model, based on aggregate polling, predicts Biden has an 87% chance of winning the election in November. Yet pundits in the campaigns are nervous to talk about the polls. Peggy Noonan, writing in the Wall Street Journal last week, said, "No one will predict the election this year because they're not idiots." They don't want to be embarrassed if they get it wrong. Brian Stelter, CNN's chief media correspondent, said most journalists and pundits this year are unwilling to make predictions, asking his own viewers, "Do you believe the polls? Should we trust them?" Of course, the elephant in the room is what happened in 2016. Many in the media then predicted that Hillary Clinton would be the inevitable winner over Trump, only to see their forecast blow up on election night. Claire Malone of 538 said commentators are emotionally reticent this year to accept the polls based on a 2016 hangover. Sam Wang, the director of the Princeton Election Consortium, said 2016 left an emotional scar about polling that is now turning into a national trauma. So what is our ability to predict elections? And why should we try? Were the poll model and the models in 2016 accurate? And should we trust them today? There is perhaps no better or more qualified person to speak to some of these issues than our guest today. Charles Franklin is a professor of law and public policy at Marquette University. He is the director of the Marquette Law School poll and a nationally recognized pollster and scholar on election modeling. Prior to Marquette, Charles was a professor of political science at the University of Wisconsin at Madison. He is co-founder of pollster.com, an award-winning website for the analysis of polling data, and he is a past president of the Society for Political Methodology. Charles also served for 8 years as a member of the Board of Overseers of the National Election Study and was a former co-director of the Big Ten poll. His articles on partisanship, public opinion, and polling have appeared in all of the major political science journals, and he has been a member of the ABC News Election Night Analysis team since 2002. Dr. Franklin is going to speak for about 30 minutes or so, and after which we'll have some time for questions. If you have questions you would like to ask of the doctor, I encourage you to send those to me at tsfoley@wsu.edu. Again, that's tsfoley as in Tom S. Foley at wsu.edu. So Charles, it's great to see you. I'm going to turn the time over to you now, and I'll be back after your presentation with some questions from our audience.
Thank you very much, Cornell. It's good to be here. I enjoyed a trip in person a few years ago out there, and I'm sorry to be doing it this way, but I'm glad to speak to the Foley Institute and the students and others that are watching. So the title today is Predicting Elections, Polls, Models, and Voting. What could possibly go wrong? Well, I just added that last one. Cornell was nice enough not to mention that I'm well qualified to talk about polling errors because my poll got the election wrong in Wisconsin. We had Clinton leading by 6 points at the end of the campaign, and Donald Trump won the state by 0.7 of a point by 23,000 votes. The fact that I had good company here and in Wisconsin, in Michigan, and in Pennsylvania is not very much of a solace, I've got to say. But it does raise the question that we want to talk about today. Broadly speaking, what's the role of polls? Are they broken? And how should we feel about them and the results they're giving us this year given the experience in 2016. So that's the agenda for the day. Since the 1930s, when we first started having national polls of reasonably good probability samples of the public, the polls, at least minimally, have been able to address the questions of who's ahead and by how much. Now, the pollsters then and now say, remember, this is a snapshot in time. It's not a forecast of what will happen on election day. And that remains just as true now as it was then. But the polls do let us watch changes in the campaign over time. Or in a year like this, watch that there's not a whole lot of change going on, at least in some states. But the state polls also let us have a chance to look at where the electoral votes are decided state by state instead of the single national number. Those state polls have really grown in volume since the 1990s, so that now, even if we could still wish we had more state level polling, we now have quite a bit to look at. And that means that the recognition of the role of the Electoral College and the role the states play in it is now sort of supported, because we're not only looking at national polls, but we are looking at those state polls as well. Well, I just mentioned that polls tell us who's ahead and by how much, but they're not forecasts. But that's not entirely true. The final polls have always been taken as a de facto forecast, even if it's not literally a model with statistical basis of what the outcome will be. So it's perfectly normal that we take those final polls leading up to Election Day, and whether explicitly or implicitly, treat them as a forecast of the election. And most of the time, that's pretty good. Oops, what about 1948 and 2016? Those are, and especially 2016 now, the prime examples of where polling was systematically wrong in ways that produced a truly surprising outcome on election night. So given that that's in our recent past, what should we think about it? Well, first of all, 2016 was shocking in part because the polls actually are usually pretty good. Otherwise, if they were usually terrible, there wouldn't have been any reason to be surprised. People would simply say, the polls were wrong again. But in 2016, after a period of time in which polling had generally been quite accurate, the fact that the polls said one thing and the voters said something else was a shock and a big surprise. And there's several reasons for that I want to talk about, and also talk about what specifically went wrong. I think two things about 2016 stand out, at least. One was the consistency of the polling showing Clinton ahead. That was true in the national polling throughout the fall, though I think it is sometimes forgotten that the margin varied, but that Clinton was ahead was a very consistent finding. And the national data led to one conclusion. State polling, including in the three critical states of Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, also consistently showed Clinton ahead. Well, the national polling did pretty well, actually. It showed a 3.1% Clinton lead on average, and her actual popular vote victory was, in fact, 2.1 points, just a 1 percentage point error, which is pretty good and actually one of the better performances in recent years. But the fact that the national vote was correctly forecast, the popular vote, but the Electoral College was not, is of course a pretty critical bit of information. It's the Electoral College that determines who occupies the White House. And because those two diverged that way, the popular vote and the Electoral College and the polls in these three Midwestern states and the actual outcome, I think those things together created further surprise on election night not just because of the poll errors, but also because the national polls were paradoxically right. So you get even more of a surprise in the Electoral College. So let's talk a little bit about what went wrong with the polls, and start with what I just alluded to, the state versus the national. National polls were pretty accurate on average. We did see some movement late in the campaign, but that movement converged on this ultimate 3.1 final average, and that was pretty close. I'm going to come back to that because I think it's important when we talk about polls being broken. What does it mean that the national data was right, but the state data not so much? So that's the first thing. What about the states? Well, there were, in fact, a lot of states where the polling was pretty accurate, but because Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania were the critical pivotal states in the Electoral College and were also decided by less than 1 percentage point in each of the states, they particularly produced this shock that consistent polling had shown one thing, but the state polls had shown something really different. Let me give you the example that in these 3 Midwestern states, there were 134 polls done across the 3 states in the fall election. And of those 134 polls, just 1 ever showed Trump ahead. So this was not simply a matter of the polling showing a 0.5% Clinton margin and Trump won by 0.7%. It's that the polls were showing substantial Clinton margins. In Wisconsin, as I mentioned, my final poll had a 6-point Clinton lead. The average of the polls in the state were about a 6.5-point lead for Clinton. So this wasn't just a close race that we got a little bit wrong. It was one that we were substantially off by. It would be a little bit different if we had seen a lot of polls showing Trump ahead, even if most had shown Clinton ahead. But again, that wasn't the case. So there was both a consensus and a large percentage point margin. In Wisconsin, there was little movement in those polls during the fall. Michigan and Pennsylvania polling showed some tightening late in the race, but continued to show Trump ahead. So that's the first kind of worry about what went wrong, and why it went wrong is it wasn't just a few polls, it was a lot of polls, and they were very consistent. In the post-mortem of the election that the American Association of Public Opinion Research, APOR, sponsored after the election, we saw several things that might have accounted for these errors. And I'm now speaking only for myself on this. I think those are partial answers, but not complete answers. So one that you've probably seen a lot of in popular reporting about the polls is this issue of weighting to education, whether pollsters adjusted their samples for the fact that more highly educated people are more apt to respond to a poll, less educated people less likely to respond. And what do you do about that? This fact that education is correlated with willingness to respond is not a new phenomenon. It's been with us for decades in polling. But what has become important in recent years is that education has become much more highly correlated with vote choice. So in the past, when education and vote were weakly correlated, it didn't matter as much if you had a higher percentage of college graduates than you know actually are in the electorate, because it didn't really correlate with the vote. But over the last 6 to 8 to 10 years, we've seen people with less than a college degree, and especially white voters with less than a college degree, become much more Republican. And therefore, if the differences in response rates means that under those with less than a college degree are less likely to respond, then that introduces a problem for your polling. So the good news about this is it's pretty easy to fix. We know from various kinds of census data pretty closely what the percentage of people without a college degree in a state are and what percentage have a college degree. We know from our raw sample what percentage of non-college and college we have. And then it's a fairly straightforward statistical method to produce weights that give extra weight to the underrepresented less than college and a little less weight to the overrepresented college graduates, so that the result is in the weighted sample, we have almost exactly the right percentage of those with less than a college degree and those with more. This same technique carries over, and we routinely weight to age. Younger people are harder to reach and therefore not as well represented as they should be. And highly or older people are more overrepresented, so we adjust for that as well. So this weighting to education became an important element of 2016. However, it's not a magic bullet. In my polling, I've always weighted for education, going back to, my days in swaddling clothes as a wee babe of a pollster. I've always thought it was important to do, and we always have, but I was still wrong. It didn't save me in 2016 that I was weighting to education. Now, after the fact, we've gone back and looked. If we had not weighted to education, we would have been more wrong. But the fact that we did weight to it didn't help us in terms of seeing the Trump victory here. So I think weighting to education is terribly important, and I would be very concerned to see polling at either the state or the national level that substantially overrepresents college-educated voters. But as I say, it's pretty easy to fix and important to do, but it's not really the magic bullet that would have somehow turned all 134 of those polls in the Midwest into polls that would have shown Trump ahead. The second possibility is really kind of twofold. It's shy Trump voters, but I think I would add to that reluctant Trump respondents. The shy Trump voter you already know about, I'm sure. That's the idea in 2016 that people would support Trump, but were reluctant to tell that to an interviewer on the telephone. I think this story fits better if you think of groups in which voting for Trump might be unusual, and therefore supporters of Trump were reluctant to say so. But when we looked at this in 2016, there was mixed evidence for it. Overall, we saw studies that interviewed people randomly, either by telephone with a human or by telephone, but with an automated system, a robocall that says press 1 for Trump, press 2 for Clinton. Overall, there was not a substantial difference in responses to those two methods. So that reduces the strength of evidence that people were genuinely reluctant to reveal their preference to a human, because they were just as reluctant to reveal it to a machine. There was a caveat there, and that one of those studies did find that highly educated and professional occupation people did appear a little more shy about reporting Trump vote. And those might well be exactly the groups in which supporting Trump in 2016 might have put you under some social pressure. So I don't want to dismiss the evidence here, but it is a lot weaker than I think the folklore would have you believe. The second is reluctant Trump respondents. And this is a concern this year that we'll talk more about in a minute, but it's the idea that some supporters of President Trump are especially hard to reach in a poll, no matter how the poll is conducted. And this is a concern, and one that is not the same as hiding your true preference. It's simply one of being unwilling to participate in polling altogether. And that raises the issue of leaving people out. In the Wisconsin data in 2016, there actually was relatively little evidence for that. we were within a percentage point and a half of the actual turnout in each of the 5 regions of the state that we break the state up into. And that includes the rural northern areas as well as the suburbs. So turnout, or that is to say, the representation of people by area, did not show any systematic underrepresentation of the more Trumpy areas of the state, or an overrepresentation of the more Democratic areas. So what's going on there? I think there's a lot of evidence from the postmortem that was done that late decisions did play a substantial role here. If we look at the exit polls done in the 3 Midwestern states and elsewhere, but focus on the 3 Midwestern states, people who decided in the last week broke overwhelmingly for Trump. In Wisconsin, those late deciders went 2/3 to Trump, 1/3 to Clinton. Another aspect of those late deciders was how many people were, I think, genuinely conflicted between the two candidates. In my polling, 22% said that they had an unfavorable view of both Trump and of Clinton. And in the exit poll in Wisconsin, they had it at 21% negative to both. So good agreement there. But in the exit polls, those conflicted voters went 60% for Trump, 20% for Clinton, and 20% for third parties. So that's the kind of asymmetric late break that I think is a very important element of the 2016 errors. And I'm going to push that just a little bit, at least with respect to Wisconsin. Donald Trump lost the primary here in April, and he lost it with a lot of Republican establishment figures, including the state's governor, Scott Walker, supporting Ted Cruz, the person who beat Donald Trump. Over the summer, Republican leaders embraced Trump, but to different degrees, and some were even critical of him during the fall, especially after the Access Hollywood tape came out. So I think it's fair to say that Wisconsin Republican leadership did not send especially clear signals to Republican voters in the state that they should back Trump, whether in the primary or, as I say, were somewhat slow to embrace him in the fall. Nevertheless, by the time we got to the election, we could see that Republicans were a bit more undecided about their choices. And we also saw that while they were genuinely mixed in their views of Trump, with substantial unfavorable views even among Republicans and independents who lean Republican, they absolutely loathed Hillary Clinton. She had phenomenally high unfavorable ratings. So I think the mix here is that you had a substantial Republican potential vote that was legitimately conflicted over their vote choice, but as the election approached, found that it was simply unacceptable to them to cross over to vote for Clinton. And so voting for Trump seemed like an acceptable choice for your party's nominee. I think it also helped that Trump had never held elective office, was known as a TV personality and a businessman. But that allowed a lot of imagination about what kind of president would he be. Those two things together, I think, allowed people in the late stages of the campaign to choose to vote with party even against reservations. Notice that will be one of the things different this year. Lots of people love the president, lots of people hate the president, but everybody has now had almost 4 years of experience seeing him in office. So that also really reduces the uncertainty this year. So let's get to the core point of polls. Are they in fact broken, and can you trust them? Well, I'm going to be fairly assertive here and say, no, they're not broken. And I think that while the experience of 2016 was certainly traumatic to pollsters like me, the subsequent performance of the polling says they're not broken. First, the national polls were accurate in 2016. And if polling was fundamentally broken, meaning people won't answer their telephone or the samples are skewed, then the national polls simply couldn't have performed as well as they did. So that's the first step, that no, polls aren't broken. When we got to 2018, we also saw generally quite a good performance of polls, though I have to admit that Missouri and Indiana both saw incorrect estimates in the Senate races. But across all of the states, we saw pretty good performance. I'll also mention my own poll, having been so wrong in 2016. In 2018, using essentially the same methods, we had the governor's race tied. The Democrat won by 1.1 percentage points. And we had the Senate race with the Democrat leading by 11, and she won by 10.9. So that is a methodological point that, without changing our methods in any substantial way, 2018 produced highly accurate estimates, while 2016 was terribly wrong. But 2014 and 2012 had been highly accurate as well. Also this year, in the spring Democratic primary, we were within a couple of points of both Biden and Sanders votes. So this is a pretty good argument, I think, both for me personally, but more importantly for the broader polling industry, that there is not something that's fundamentally flawed in the way we conduct polls or the way we're able to conduct them in this current period. Still, there's a lot of variation in the polls. I just checked a few minutes ago. The current national polling ranges from Biden ahead by 5 points to ahead by 13 points. So there is quite a range there, and it means that one can certainly understandably go, geez, I don't really know what to believe when I see this much variation. But that's pretty normal variation. And I think maybe we reify polls by thinking they should all be within a couple of points of each other, but that's really not true. This is why looking at the polling average is so valuable. It takes all of that spread and focuses it down to an average. I'd also say one other thing about the rhetoric of broken polls. These conspicuous failures in 2016 provides the basis for a rhetorical rejection of polls, much in the way that fake news provides the basis for dismissing reporting. There's now a pretty concerted effort to dismiss unfavorable polls to any candidate by citing 2016 and using that as a rhetorical device to dismiss bad news. It's the perfect political rhetorical device precisely because it rests on real errors of 2016, but then it generalizes that to undermine confidence in polling as a whole, in the same way that the fake news storyline undermines confidence in reporting as a whole. So, is everything fine? Probably, but the lessons of 2016 are real, and we should be, and I think are being, a lot more vigorous in pursuing potential sources for error. The recent Nate Cohn article in the New York Times in the Upshot section back in July 29th, if you look for it, titled, "Are the Polls Missing Republican Voters?" This goes to both the shy Trump voters I was mentioning, but also the reluctant respondents who support Trump. And the beauty here is that the New York Times Siena polling works off of registered voter lists. So in all the states where voting is by, or registration is by party, they can actually know exactly who is responding and who is not. And they can know whether they're missing more Republicans or missing more Democrats. And at least as of July, in Cohn's analysis, registered Republicans were actually more likely than registered Democrats to respond to the poll. So that's something that people can look at, pollsters can look at and check whenever they're using a voter list as the basis of their sampling, which many pollsters are. I've looked at the question of what about less likely voters? We hear a lot about likely voters, but what if some of the people who don't usually vote do come to the polls this year? Would that change our results? And with respect to the Wisconsin data, among likely voters over the summer and fall, we have a 5-point Biden lead, 49 to 44. But among those who are less likely to vote, we actually have a 9-point Biden lead, 40 to 31, but with a very large 29% who say they will not vote for either Biden or Trump. They might vote third party, they might say they don't know. But the main point here is this is still a Biden advantage among these less likely voters, but with the need to look at that 29% who say they might vote for someone else. They're a bit of a puzzle, I'll tell you, because when we look at them, we find they give President Trump a very negative job rating, but they also give Joe Biden an unfavorable rating on him. And so that does leave a little ambiguity about where these folks might go if they come to the polls. And finally, we look at new voters, whereas the New York Times, going off of a voter list, you have to be registered to vote to be on the voter list. I call random phone numbers, and so we can pick up new voters, people who are just now registering to vote. But when we look at them, we have a 6-point lead for Biden among registered voters, and we have a 5-point lead for Biden among newly registered voters. So just slightly tighter among the newly registered, but with Biden still ahead. So those are some of the diagnostics that we're doing, and we're doing routinely. I want to close with just a couple of minutes on forecasting and forecasting models, because I think there has become some confusion between what the polls say and what the forecasts say, and how do these relate to each other. If the polls were wrong in 2016, some of the prominent forecasting models were also badly wrong. Two of the most prominent of those are the Huffington Post model and the Princeton Election Consortium models, both of which were giving over 95% and often 99% probabilities that Clinton would win. 538.com was a bit more cautious, but even it had over about a 1 in 4, I think a little under 30% chance that Trump would win. That was unlikely, but it wasn't inconceivably unlikely the way the 99% Clinton win probabilities were. But I think this contributed to the sense that the polling was wrong in 2016 because the election forecasts that were largely based on that polling were terribly wrong. And so this amplified the errors of the polls. What's in the forecasting this year? How has it changed or improved? I think, first of all, the lesson learned by pollsters in 16 was also learned by the forecasters. They've modified their models and done some things to fix what they had in them that was making them overly certain about the outcome. Even so, as Cornell said at the start of this, the 538 forecast is up at, I believe, 86 or 87% win probability for Biden. So this problem is not completely gone, though that high probability could just be correct. What you ought to think about with the forecast models, whether it's 538 or The Economist, which has an excellent new forecasting model this year for the first time, is how they put things together. And I'm going to be brief here. First is a set of fundamentals. These usually involve the economy and several measures of how the economy stands in advance of the election. Sometimes it includes past election results to account for the fact that, Massachusetts is different from Utah, and that's a pretty predictable difference from year to year. But those set the priors, the things you would believe before the campaign begins in earnest, and certainly before the fall campaign begins. Then the core is the polling. This is where polling errors enter into forecasting errors, because the polls are providing the fundamental dynamic of all the forecasting models. If they only use the prior, they could make their forecast on August 1st and stop because there's not really any further updates to the data. But with the polling, you get the dynamics that change day to day and state to state. And that's really at the core. You can read through Nate Silver's account of his model or the Economist's explanation of their model. They're very detailed, they're very good, but they're not light reading. But in different ways, but with the same basic goal. They're both trying to capture dynamics over time and state level results that they can use for the Electoral College results. And those are, I think, critical things. There is one last point, and that is how much fundamental uncertainty is there in an election forecast? Meaning, if we're forecasting on September 1st, we ought to be less certain about the outcome than if we're forecasting on November 1st. But even on November 1st or November 2nd, we should still have some fundamental level of uncertainty. That level is largely based on estimates, statistical estimates from past elections. But we should never be fully certain because of that basic irreducible element. I'd say there's also a technical issue here, and that is there's simply not enough observed election outcomes in history. So we always risk overfitting the model, refining our models to fit the past 60 years of elections, but then not having any more elections to fit it to. You have to wait 4 years for another presidential outcome. Compare that with weather forecasting, which is wonderful because you get to do thousands of forecast places every day and learn the next day whether you were right or wrong. Did it rain or not rain? That's not true of elections, and therefore we have a much harder problem getting a fit that's reasonable and not running this risk of overfitting. That, I think, is one of the continuing problems. Let me close with this. What's the value of doing all of this? Should we even try to do this? Well, I think for both polls and forecasts, informing the public is, to me, the most valuable thing. Campaigns and interest groups and businesses always do polling. They also always keep that information to themselves unless it serves their interests. Media polls, academic polls, and other public polling at least serves the purpose of telling the public that kind of information that government officials, businesses, interest groups would otherwise have and keep to themselves. So I do believe this is a broadly important thing for informing the public. There's also the question of the use of forecasts and polls by campaigns and political actors. That's a very different question, and it goes to the question of, well, what can I do with this? Let me use another analogy, not the weather this time. Think about sports forecasts. There are a variety of sites now that will tell you the win probability for every second during a basketball game or every out or every pitch even of a baseball game. Those win probabilities are interesting to watch. Though it's striking that sometimes you see a team go from a 80 or 90% chance of winning to actually losing the game. So that's useful to know that those models can go wrong too. But a broader question is, what would a coach do if somebody told them, okay, coach, you now have a 0.7 probability of winning? I don't think there's very much that a coach, or more broadly, a campaign manager, can do with that number by itself. On the other hand, analytics can be more helpful. And here we're looking at both polling and forecasting. If I could tell you what groups are you doing better with or what groups are you doing worse with, you could do something with that. And going back to the sports analogy, if the analytics can say, what play should you call that has the highest chance of increasing your win probability, then that would seem like a worthwhile thing. But these are not things for the public. These are things that professionals can use for the purpose of informing the public. I think it is less valuable to have those kinds of forecasts. finally, I want to wrap up with this, that polls can provide more details than I think forecasts in terms of who's voting for whom and why. And in that can provide a bit more context and understanding of the dynamics that are driving an election. And I like to believe those things are more valuable than just the horse race numbers alone. But in the end, neither polls nor forecasts vote. That remains in the hands of citizens, and that's where it should be. The outcomes of elections continue to belong to the voters in this republic and not in the hands of pollsters or of forecasters. If there is a valuable lesson in the failures of the polls in 2016, I think it's exactly that. Polls don't vote, people do. Be sure you go out and vote for whoever you support. Thank you. Let's go to Q&A.
All right. Hey, thanks, Charles. That was great. We have lots of questions to get to. Let me start with one that I think is on the mind of a lot of people, and that is there a problem with polls and forecast models in terms of diminishing citizen participation in the election process, in the sense that they might give us a false sense of certainty, and so voters don't turn out, or just a diminished sense that there's agency on the part of voters?
I think those are great questions. And I think the first part I would say is that there is a risk of that. I think it's interesting that campaigns, both campaigns in an election, see opposite threats to themselves. If they're behind, they fear that this will discourage their supporters who won't turn out. But if they're ahead, they argue that this will create a false sense of security among their supporters who won't turn out. So in the end, both sides see polls as diminishing their support, no matter which one of them is ahead. I think that there's empirical evidence that says that the polls are not systematically wrong in either direction. And so it doesn't seem like the leading candidate systematically underperforms what the polls say, or that the losing candidate systematically overperforms those polls. So I think that's the good news. There's certainly this plausible argument of demobilization, but the data suggests that it's not such a big deal. I do think, and certainly the rhetoric after 2016 would have you believe that the consistency of the polling, the magnitude of the margin, and especially those forecasts with such high win probabilities may have created a false sense of what the outcome was almost surely to be, and that people may have changed their actions in light of that. Hence my closing remarks. It's not in my hands, it's in your hands.
Okay. Listen, Juliana Wells asks a couple of questions. The first is what do we know about the turnout in this upcoming election, and what can we predict about that? But also she raises the question of, are we likely to see late breakers like we did in 2016?
Yeah, I think on turnout, it looks like we will have a very high turnout election. Voters on both sides are reporting high levels of certainty that they will turn out and high levels of excitement about voting this time. There are obviously the complications of absentee and early voting and election day in-person voting with some risk of the coronavirus. So I do think there's some uncertainty there. But setting that uncertainty aside, I think most of the evidence points to a very high turnout election across the country, but also in battleground states as well. I'm sorry, you got to remind me of what the second part of the question was.
Just about late breakers.
Oh, and late breakers. I think we saw that in a big way last time. I think it's less likely now for a couple of reasons. One is we do see both state and national polling roughly half as many undecideds now as we saw at this time in 2016. So the simple pool that could potentially break late seems to be a lot smaller. The other is, dare I remind you, this has been a year of a lot of developments. Everything from a trade war with China, I bet nobody remembers that, from a year ago, to impeachment, to the coronavirus, to the economic consequences, to Black Lives Matter protests. And across all this time, we've seen modest movement in the polling. Again, if you believe the polling. But I think that is another element. And then the last is the one I mentioned earlier, that Trump is president. People have a very strong view of him. We see in our polling about 80% who either strongly approve or strongly disapprove of him. So there's a smaller pool of people who are ambivalent about him. And finally, the dislike of both candidates is much lower. Here in Wisconsin, that was 22% last time. It's about 8% now. So I think all of those things reduce the chance of a late swing. But again, if there's a lesson in 2016, it is that between the time the polls complete, roughly a week out from the election, and election day, there's always the chance that something shifts.
Okay. Robin Valdez and several others have asked questions about specifically what do you think pollsters have done to change their weighting to account for 2016? And I'll just throw into that, there's a specific change that may be occurring in this election, and that is COVID may affect how people vote, especially the elderly population. And I wonder if you're taking that into account in your election rulings.
In terms of the weighting, I think there has been a move for those that weren't weighting to education to now do so, though there are some holdouts that still aren't choosing to do that. I frankly don't quite understand why. It's not that hard to do. Some of them argue that it didn't really affect their polls, but I think it's good practice. So I would encourage that. I think all of us update our demographic targets from one year to the next, simply to reflect changing populations in age or education or race. And so those kinds of changes have been made. The last is one that I've certainly done, and that is we're pushing people who are undecided a little bit more by, if they say undecided, well, if you had to vote today, how would you lean? So that we can at least look at that, and also doing the kinds of looks at less likely voters or new voters that I mentioned earlier. So I think all of those things are beginning to, or are being done. What I don't think has happened is that there haven't been wholesale changes. And I think that's largely because the look at what went wrong in 16 really doesn't point to fundamental methodological failures. We're already calling 65 to 70% cell phones. So that's really not an issue at all. Newer methodologies like internet-based polls are being widely used, and so we have the point of comparison with them. Finally, the issue of the older voters who might be dissuaded from voting in person, we're measuring that all along of, have you voted already? As Wisconsin has begun absentee voting, we find that about 14% have already cast their vote by absentee. And so we capture that in the polls right from the beginning. The last thing would be, if you have an unusual outbreak of COVID close to election day, would that affect the in-person election day vote at all? And that's a little harder to know.
Okay. I'm curious why, the education factor threw off the battleground state polls, but not the national polls so much in 2016.
Yeah, that's more of a puzzle. I think one is that the national pollsters, by and large, have always weighted to education, so it probably wasn't as much of a issue for them. The other is that these three Midwestern battleground states of Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin do have an unusually high concentration of non-college white voters. And so the population that most swung to Trump, especially white non-college men, may have been underrepresented if you weren't weighting to education in these three states.
Okay. So Matt Carroll asks, what your view is in terms of comparing poll-based modeling versus more fundamentals models like the primary model or economic model. And he, in particular, points out right now, if you're using fundamentals on the economy, Trump may have a much better chance than is predicted, right? So.
Right. I have mixed feelings about this. I think the fundamental models are actually very useful for setting what our baseline expectations should be going into the election. This year, that's terribly complicated because of the sudden and sharp changes in the economy, both going down and now partially coming back up. So that has kind of created a case that was simply beyond the scope of any previous data. Makes it a little harder to know what to believe this time. I think the real issue, though, is that the fundamental models don't have any dynamic during the campaign. They're implicitly saying that everything that's going to happen in the campaign is already structured by the state of the economy or the president's job approval or second term or third term or not for the party in power. So I think that you have to have some kind of polling-based dynamic during the campaign if you think that campaigns matter. And I believe they do, at least at the margin, but that's not to dismiss the fundamentals at all. I think both of the major forecasts now, 538 and The Economist, both build in those fundamentals to some extent.
Yeah. Models, can become more or less accurate by adding more and more information into the modeling. But at what point does the addition of more information detract from the usefulness of the models and actually informing us of what's going on?
I think it is a complication, and it's in two ways. One that I mentioned is overfitting, that there's a finite number of elections. And even if you're doing 50 state forecasts for each election, that's still a modest number of cases going back in time. And of course, with limited state level polling in earlier years. So I think there's a big problem with that. Putting in 12 economic variables instead of 3, I think at one level is an empirical question. Is there really an observable gain from 12? If there is, I suppose we should go ahead and use them and not artificially restrict the scope of the model. But having said that, I myself prefer somewhat simpler models. This also goes to what can you communicate to the public? I did my homework for today and I went back and read the full description of both the 538 and the Economist models. And I must say that for someone who doesn't do this for a living, it's a little opaque about what the primary important things are and what are very confusing technical details. So to the extent that we're trying to inform the public, I think all those details do risk overwhelming them, in the same way that I have a casual interest in physics, but there's no point in a physicist trying to explain technical details to me. I'll be lost in a second.
All right. Joseph Hiller asks what you think of some of these new types of models in sampling, these multi-level regression models like YouGov uses. What do you think about their accuracy relative to more traditional polls?
Yeah, I think that the multi-level models are a very important innovation of the last 10 years, 15 years. They've been used more and more. They've mostly been used successfully, though like all innovations, maybe too much is claimed for them. But I do think in terms of leveraging the information we have from a limited number of polls, they provide us a good principled method to try to make estimates at the state level or potentially county level if we were looking at state polling. So I approve of them that way, but I do worry a little bit about them being oversold. They're good and they're probably an improvement over a scatter of limited state polls, but they're perhaps not a full replacement for high quality state level polling.
Okay. Monica Chavez asks a question about putting this particular election into sort of into historical context. Is this a particularly difficult election to model? Is it more or less difficult than elections in the past?
Oh boy, that's a tough one. I think at the fundamental level, too many uses of the word fundamental. An election with a sitting incumbent seeking re-election should be easier to estimate than an open seat race. I think that much I think is easy to say. You simply know a lot more about the incumbent. You've had the experience of them. Also, in the last two presidencies, both Obama and Trump, we've seen exceptionally high levels of partisan polarization, and that helps to stabilize the election. Democratic support for Biden is running, in my data in Wisconsin, between 93 and 97%. Republican support for Trump running typically between 89 and 92 or so, with crossover votes very limited, under 10% for Republicans, under 5% for Democrats. So that helps stabilize the polling at least. And if it's accurate of what happens on election day, then that should improve our estimates. Then there are all the things that we didn't see coming 12 months ago. The pandemic is the really obvious part of this, but related to that is the shift to absentee voting and the counting of those ballots and whether they're delivered and all of those concerns. And then finally, while it will be resolved after the election, it is unclear at what point it's clear what the final vote tallies really are as we wait for absentees to be counted. And there is this year, I think, an absolute certainty that the absentee ballots will be much more favorable to Biden and the election day more favorable to Trump. So knowing when those things are both completely counted is going to be a ultimately resolved problem, but it's going to be a big problem as we go into the election.
Yeah, I wonder, given how fixed people's attitudes are about Trump right now, whether there used to be this discussion about an October surprise, and we've already had lots of October surprises in this election. Is there anything really that could shake up those fixed attitudes, do you think?
I think given the experiences we've had over the last year, it seems unlikely. I invested a good bit of money in doing monthly polling during the impeachment process, before, during, and after. And we saw a movement in views of impeachment of less than 3 points either way, as you went through all of the pre-impeachment testimony, the impeachment vote, the post-impeachment material, and then the vote in the hearings in the Senate. And we just saw a little change in that. And I think that is a great example of just how stable people are in their feelings about this. And then we get this virus that comes and is certainly unique in our lifetimes. President Trump did get a boost in approval, especially for his handling of coronavirus at the beginning in March, but has steadily declined over time in that approval. And actually on that measure has shown a good deal more variation in his approval than he has shown in overall approval. If we compare approval variation over presidents since Roosevelt, Trump is by far the least variable in his job approval. And I think, again, that reflects the deep partisan polarization and the sharp feelings towards him, both pro and anti, that stabilize his approval and likely stabilize the election as well.
Okay, I think you probably just answered this last question. Our time's starting to run short. But a lot of viewers want to know what your prediction is for the election. And keep in mind, this is being taped.
Well, I'm kind of used to that, because on the 28th of October, I will come out and I will present our final election numbers. And in 2016, I walked out and I said, Hillary Clinton has a 6-point lead in Wisconsin. And I've been happily held responsible for that ever since. Not happy that I was wrong, but that is a case where if you're a pollster, you don't hide this. You come out and you report it, and it's there for eternity. And God knows it'll probably be engraved on my gravestone as well.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm afraid our time is up. Before I thank our guest today, let me remind you all that we'll be back next week with our series. Next Wednesday at noon, we have Kostas Panagopoulos, who will be talking about the state of the House and Senate campaigns and making predictions about those. And I also want to let you know that we've added another event, which will be on Monday, October the 26th at noon, when we'll have Amanda Hollis-Brusky from Pomona College discussing the Barrett nomination and how that might impact the election. So make sure you have both of those on your calendars. And now I want to thank Charles for really an interesting conversation about polls and modeling. This has become a really interesting topic this year, and you've done a terrific job, I think, at explaining some of the problems and promises of polls and modeling. So thanks, Charles, and I hope to see you all next week.